Good afternoon. Today is Monday, the 14th of October, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. Delighted to have with me today Diane Rasmussen-McGaddy from Scotland, and also Ben Rubin, who's joining us with a live link from London. Well, I'm going to kick straight off today with a reminder that UK Column has often said to our viewers and listeners, if you don't understand what's happening in politics, try coming in from the angle that we are being attacked by our own government. And I stand by that statement. Our audience can have a think about it and what it means. But first of all, let's just get a little look at what politics really is and how it works. And of course, it's not as simple as thinking that we've got a government system with a cabinet office, with a political party who are debating serious matters in Parliament to form policy, which then goes via the civil service, because the reality is, to one side, we've got immensely powerful corporations, foundations, think tanks and charities. And on the other side, we've got the immensely powerful global organizations such as the UN, the World Economic Forum, global mayors, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, and many others. And none of that system, or this complete system, can work without media driving the agenda, telling people what to think and what to believe. And to make this work, it's got to be funded, and this is where the real power is, through the global banking system. So, Ben, I'm going to bring you straight in and say, of course, you're telling us what those corporations, foundations, think tanks and charities are doing, plus the power base that is the UN. So welcome to today's news.
Hello, everybody. Yes, our political classes aren't actually running the country. As far as I can ascertain, they're delivering a policy agenda that's being set at a global level by the organisations that Brian has just described. And the political classes on both the left and right are essentially there to deliver and sell the message to the electorate in the respective nation states. And we're going to talk a bit today about the top level, the people really setting the agenda and pulling the strings. And we're going to talk about a new term that has just emerged called radical centrism, which is supposedly the antidote to authoritarianism. Or is it? We'll find out. And as I say, it's coming down from the very top levels of the system. We're going to talk about this gentleman, Daniel Sachs, who is a Swedish businessman, or to use a term that I've heard used on the column before, a mystery man of no importance. Yeah, that's all you need to know about it. So who is Daniel Sachs? I've talked about him before a few months ago, but I will just remind you because there's quite a lot around this gentleman. So he is a senior advisor at Chatham House. He is one of 7 trustees and vice chair of the board of Open Societies Foundation. And he's also the chairman of the Open Societies Foundation Investment Committee. So he directs their finance decisions. He's a founding member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And he's also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum in 2007. He was attending a meeting held by the European Council on Foreign Relations at the Munich Security Conference back in February, and you can see him here in the centre of the image, sitting in very close proximity to Ursula von der Leyen and Alex Soros, who is obviously now the president of Open Societies, now that George Soros' father has stepped down from that role. So this is an exceptionally well-connected individual. He's also got a direct link to the Bilderberg meetings because he's a director of Wallenberg Investments, and the founder of Wallenberg Investments is Marcus Wallenberg, who's on the Bilderberg steering committee. Daniel Sachs has his own foundation, the Daniel Sachs Foundation, which was founded in 2010. Through this, he's invested in and ultimately controls these 3 organizations: Multitudes Foundation, which is focused on stimulating grassroots radical left-wing political activism across Europe, with a particular focus on new immigrant communities from sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. He also runs Apolitical Foundation, which is focused on developing a new class of political leadership, and Apolitical, which exists to retrain and reframe UK civil servants. As I say UK, they're operating in 170 countries worldwide, and they see this as part of and integrated what they call a democracy flywheel. So they use these organizations to reconnect or connect with voters, the people, to vote in politicians who they train and ultimately control, certainly ideologically, if in no other way, whose policies are then delivered by a civil service who is also trained by organizations run and funded by this gentleman, not run by, funded by this gentleman. I spoke about this back in June. If you go back and watch that on the UK column website, the 28th of June, you can get a much more in-depth look at what those three organisations are up to. These organisations are also part of, slap bang in the centre of this ecosystem that I spoke about last week when I was talking about Julie Inman Grant and Vital Voices. So this is this network of high-powered women in politics, business and civil society who are essentially rolling out this agenda. This is all backed by the US State Department, by the British Foreign Office, United Nations, and they are delivering this radical centrist vision, ultimately, which comes from this guy, right? It comes from Daniel Sachs, and you're going to start hearing this a lot more, I believe. So he was speaking at this event in September, just 2 days before the UN General Assembly. So they're obviously making good on the opportunity of having a number of global leaders up in the northeast of the US. So this was hosted in Montreal in Canada. And Sachs spoke on stage. He delivered a keynote. I'm going to show you some clips of it. And he was talking about a number of activities that he's delivering and his foundations are delivering. Specifically, he mentioned working in Poland earlier this year to help Donald Tusk get into power. And he describes what he calls two competing energy fields. Yeah, two competing energy fields, which I think is a really interesting view into the mindset of these people, how they view the world and how they project power ultimately. And those energy fields represent a tug of war between two main drivers of political engagement. This is a direct quote. One is the rising support of authoritarianism. The other is the mobilization of young voters, especially young women, in protection of the fundamental values of democracy. Now, for me, that means right versus left. Yeah, authoritarianism, as they would see it, on the right, and then the young voters, especially the young women, protecting the fundamental values of democracy on the left. And as we know, Daniel Sachs is on the board of the Open Societies Foundation. And we've spoken a couple of months ago, maybe it was just a month ago, actually, time does fly, about George Soros's role in backing right-wing figures such as Paul Marshall, as well as left-wing organizations and figures like David Miliband and International Rescue, but also BLM, in order ultimately to create chaos within our societies. And Daniel Sachs sits right at the center of that. He's been talking about this gender split for quite some time, and he's very clearly trying to widen it. That's what a lot of this activity is about. That's why organizations like Vital Voices exist. And a lot of this is about political actors, but also it's being driven very heavily by the media. And thanks to Kenny for sending over these statistics from a blog post by David Rosado. I recommend going to read this article. It's a great article which talks about the increase in divisive terminology used by the New York Times and the Washington Post post-2010. There's been a huge uptick in the use of terms like patriarchy, gender discrimination, sexism, white supremacy, which is feeding directly into the division that we're seeing in society. This has been constructed. It's been constructed by people like Daniel Sachs and these organizations. So they're creating chaos. And his solution to the chaos, ultimately, that he and his ecosystem around him have created is radical centrism, which they present as the solution to authoritarianism. Right? Now, I believe that these people are disingenuous at best, and they are certainly radical. And we know that they are guided by the ideology of Saul Alinsky. And one of Alinsky's rules for radicals is to accuse your opponent of what you're doing, to create confusion and inculcate voters against evidence of your own guilt. So actually, I believe that radical centrism isn't the antidote to authoritarianism. I believe that it is authoritarianism. That's what we're talking about. They've driven people to the fringes on the left and the right, and then they're going to drive the institutions back into the center to deliver order, a new order out of the chaos that they've created. So this new ideology, radical centrism, has three fundamental components. Let's hear now from Daniel Sachs about each of those.
And radical centrism for me stands on three legs. The first leg is shifting focus from the issues that dominate national populist agendas, and we've heard a lot about this here, and moving to the everyday concerns of voters, the cost of living, healthcare, economic opportunity. And it turns out also in some of the polling that data praxis has done that those are more important for a lot of voters, for most voters in some countries. And then developing new innovative policy agendas based on those types of issues that acknowledge people's very real concerns.
Yeah, so that's the first leg of radical centrism, is shifting focus away from issues like mass immigration, for example, and towards things like cost of living, economic opportunity, healthcare, despite the fact that the policies handed down from these organizations have destroyed our economic systems and destroyed our health, right? They're here with the solution, again, to the problems that they've created, as far as I can tell. Let's hear about the second leg of radical centrism.
But secondly, and the second leg, which is even more important, I would argue, is radical institutional renewal. It is about a deep renewal of leadership. It is about broadening engagement with diverse voices. It's about fresh faces, new voices. It is about new narratives. It also is really important to close the gap, the trust gap between institutions, the elected, and the people they represent or are supposed to be representing. And that means rethinking how politics interacts with citizens and voters through deliberation, through participatory processes, citizens' assemblies, etc. And it involves real work on inclusion, rethinking who holds power and how political institutions relate to the people that they serve. And in totality, it really is about reimagining politics, not only policies.
It's about breaking traditional power structures, reimagining political institutions, bringing in new leaders, diverse voices, new narratives. That's what Multitudes in particular is doing. And also bringing in new forms of democratic decision-making, deliberation, participatory processes, citizens' assemblies, things that we've been talking about for a very long time and that are being promoted and delivered ultimately by the democratic flywheel, the democracy flywheel, the organizations Daniel Sachs is backing. Let's hear the third and final leg of radical centrism.
And then thirdly, doing all of this while remaining passionately anchored in the core ideology and the core values that come from the ideological roots that you all represent. Dig where you stand and take the test every day, whether the ideas you have and whether the actions you want to put in place can be seen through that lens, and when you can proudly uphold those values and ideologies. And in a way, part of that is also recommitting to and reaffirming the foundational values of liberal democracy, values that a majority of voters, as it turns out, the broad centre, still stand by and are willing to fight for. That's it. So it's all up to you. Thank you.
Liberal democracy. Let's read between the lines a little bit here. I believe that means we can do whatever we want if enough people go along with it. That's what I think liberal democracy ultimately is. Yeah, when you take it to its extreme, and actually if you take it to its extreme, it also looks a bit like this. Do what thou wilt. Yeah, I think that's what potentially we're looking at here. He says it's over to you. Who's he talking to in the audience? Trudeau, right? So it's in Canada. Trudeau's, unfortunately for Canada, is the Prime Minister. Who else is there? Ardern on the right-hand side there. So we got a top level audience receiving their briefing ultimately here from Daniel Sachs. And who's helping him to deliver it? He's got two guys here, one on the left and one on the right. On his left, as we're looking at the picture here, that is Aaron Chowdhury. And Chowdhury was the new media and communications whiz kid who got Obama elected twice. This is a top-level communications guy, big-time propagandist for Obama. And on the right-hand side of, as we were looking at that picture of Daniel Sachs, is this fella, Paul Alarcon, who is the General Secretary of the Daniel Sachs Foundation. He's also an Obama leader for Europe in 2023. And if we remember from the June show, he's also quite keen for us to know believe that he's Jewish. He's certainly very sympathetic to Judaism. It says here, the world was created for me, which is from the Babylonian Talmud, which I believe could provide us some explanation as to the theological positions, at least, driving this agenda.
Right, Ben, thank you very much for that excellent analysis. The beast is emerging. It's becoming ever easier to see it. And of course, we have to see it to be able to fight against it. But let's follow on through, because of course, for all this to happen, the media must be on the side of these individuals. And you've just reminded us of the increasing use of the woke agenda and woke language in American press at least, but of course it's also happening over here in UK. So what better place to go than the BBC? And in fact, last week, a number of people contacted me talking about a particularly unpleasant video that the BBC had put out, but this is how they were advertising it. The fight for truth is on. BBC pulls back the curtain on the fight against disinformation. So let's have a look at the true little horror film that the BBC produced.
Disinformation. You think you're winning.
There is no climate change.
Fooling people in the most sophisticated ways.
I control the Met Police. They will obey orders.
You fueled hate and confusion.
End up with a complete erosion of trust.
The pandemic wasn't real.
Unleashed conspiracies.
Social media posts
About the Southport riots.
Endangered lives. Undermined democracies. And you make our job seem almost impossible.
fake news.
Lying about anything.
Almost. You see, it's because of you we get up in the morning and work through the night.
We're going this way?
All over the world.
And that's the right
24/7.
going on the line.
The more you try to drown out reality, the harder we'll work to verify the facts. And with our expertise, you have nowhere to hide.
Charged as false.
We will find your sleights of hand and expose them.
Baseless rumors began spreading.
So no matter how hard it gets, we'll never give up. We'll be watching. We'll be ready. Because it's the pursuit of truth that gives us our calling.
The fight for truth is on.
Well, there we go. Lies, lies and more lies from the BBC as they puff up their own image. Let's have a look at what their chief executive for BBC News had to say. Aside from the lengths that we go to in the pursuit of truth, she said, "We're proud to be the world's most trusted news provider, and I hope this film shows just how hard we work each and every day to earn the trust of our audiences." Then there was another quote by this gentleman, Charles Basil, who's the chief brand officer for the BBC. And he said, "This campaign speaks to the BBC's mission to deliver accurate, impartial news globally and illustrates our commitment to pursuing the truth in an age of disinformation." Now, this man, I couldn't find a photograph of him on the BBC website, but he's the former global vice president of Absolut Vodka Sweden, so selling alcohol, and apparently turning around fatigued brands. This made me smile because presumably the BBC is telling us that they are a fatigued brand, which is why they've had to bring this man on board. But if you really want to know who's doing the dirty stuff against members of the public, well, here's BBC Creative, and they're proud to put out a big photograph of all their staff. Remember that we are now the target of these individuals because we dare to challenge what they and the government and the establishment have to say. But apparently the BBC's mission is to act in the public interest, serving all audiences by informing, educating and entertaining, and BBC Creative is here to help deliver on that promise. Now, keep that in mind while we have a look at how the BBC reacted to a Freedom of Information request. This was back in May 2023. We did talk about it at the time, but somebody asked that the BBC provide a structure chart including names for BBC Verify. They asked for a budget for BBC Verify, and they also asked for the information that was used to justify the setting up of Verify. This is how the BBC responded. It said that information that relates to the BBC's output or information that supports and is closely associated with these creative activities is considered to be held by the BBC for the purposes of art, journalism and literature. Such information held by the BBC and other public service broadcasters falls outside the scope of the FOI Act. And it went on to say, by ensuring information about matters including editorial decisions about programming and budgets allocated to such programming are not subject to undue public scrutiny. So don't think you're going to be asking the BBC for truth, because they're simply going to tell you to go away and not bother them. But they ended their response by saying it's important that the BBC is an independent and impartial news organisation. Of course it is, as long as you don't ask them any direct questions. So who's responsible for this atrocity on the licence-paying public? Well, here's the chair of the BBC board, Dr. Samir Shah. He's the man responsible. Let's have a little look at him. He's responsible for upholding and protecting the independence of the BBC and ensuring that the BBC fulfills its mission to inform, educate and entertain and promote its public purposes, presumably to its entire satisfaction. He ensures that the board's decision-making is in the public interest, informed with the best interests of the audience, and appropriate regard for the impact of decisions on the wider media market. The board, under the chair, also must ensure the BBC maintains the highest standards of corporate governance. And he's paid £160,000 a year for at least 3 days a week. So just think about that for the average person in UK. But this is where it's getting interesting, because his half-brother, Mohit Bakaya, is the BBC's Director of Speech and Controller of Radio 4. So these two men between them absolutely control the BBC. There's the amount of pay, up to nearly £220,000 for his brother. But Dr. Shah proposes to recuse himself with regards to any decision-making relating directly to Mohit Bakaya that may reach the board. But then the BBC note goes on to say that audio is central to the BBC's content portfolio and future strategy. As such, it would not be practical or advisable for him as chairman to recuse himself from the board's work in this area. So there's a conflict of interest, but the BBC gets round it by saying it's too difficult to separate these two individuals. This is truly extraordinary, should not be permitted, and should be stopped as soon as possible. But let's have a listen to what the half-brother had to say when he got an award.
The refugee crisis is such a huge story at the moment, and there's been so much attention on journalism. And frankly, one of the things, and it was borne out in the decisions we made, these stories are actually having an impact on the political process. So, getting one of these, I think, is a real recognition that not just of kind of the quality of journalism, but actually the value of the journalism in moving and setting the agenda for the debate around the political story.
So this is setting the political agenda. It's not commenting on it, it's driving it. This is exactly what Ben is talking about. And let's have a look at One World Media, that is the organisation that was busy stroking his ego.
The mentorship and the guidance that One World Media provided was pivotal for me in shaping and structuring the film.
One World Media team provided me the psychological safety, industrial mentorship that I had no idea I needed.
Through the short documentary filmmaking forum, it was just the perfect place for me to build and grow my career with international media entities.
One World Media connects me to filmmakers in the grassroots, bridging journalists to broadcasters like the BBC.
One World Media Award motivates me to continue to work on such stories and uncover issues of environmental injustice.
So this is effectively an organisation grooming other media, particularly in developing countries. But let's have a look and see how independent it is. If we bring this on screen, have a look at the trustees, and oh dear, what do we find? We find that actually Muriel Lamin, Head of Business Development, BBC World Service, is one of the trustees. But to give you an example of the power base, here is Mauricio Sadapaz, who's Global Head of Sales, Bank of America. And if we get further into this organisation for the partners, we quickly see the BBC is one of them, so no independence here, but also the British Council. And here's the Money European Bank and the European Investment Bank. So this is exactly the same setup that Ben has been talking about at the start of the news today. But of course, this is the power of the media. And if we have a look at it here, this is how to join and give vast sums of money, but down at the bottom it's talking about the Global Forum for Media Development. And if we have a look at that, this brings us straight back into George Soros and Open Society. And we've got the National Endowment for Democracy and Open Society Foundations. And if we have a look at what they call programmatic funders, we then get back into the power base. We've got the Swiss government, we've got BBC Media Action, and indeed we've also got Open Society. So we'll leave that one there, but nothing works without the power of the media, and the power of the established media is to close down free speech, to stop people calling out the attacks that are coming in from the government and these global elites. Diane, let's bring you on, because of course closing down free speech is heavily targeted at the moment at academia.
Yes, thanks, Brian. And hello, Ben. It's good to be here today. I have been seeing in the news, and I don't know if it's because it's happening more often or because it's finally just starting to come out more, of more and more academics who are being attacked for free speech and for trying to share the truth on what's been happening to them as a result of practicing their free speech rights. I want to first call to everyone the work of Professor Frank Ferretti, who has been, at the forefront of a lot of this for a long time. And he had a new book come out recently called The War Against the Past: Why the West Must Fight for Its History. And of course, his book launch, I have the book right here. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. His book launch was canceled at a place in the West where he was going to talk about what is happening to our history, unfortunately. We have other academics who are talking more about academics who had to leave the UK because they had pro-Brexit views, for example. And the person who went through this said, well, it's just a place of indoctrination now in any UK university, that we can no longer speak out about what we really think as a professional. We have an Oxford professor recently who called out the state schools in the UK for saying that students who go to state schools can't read books. And what he says is that those students come from disadvantaged schools where the teacher's main task is crowd control, and the demands in terms of reading long books are just not there. That sounds really harsh, but it is actually the reality. We have a professor up here at the University of Edinburgh who had a major hit piece come out on him recently in the Times, saying that he was spreading misinformation about what's going on in Ukraine and Syria. UK column viewers will know that probably a lot of what he said is actually more of the reality of what's going on compared to what we see in the mainstream news. I would also like to point out the recent UK column article from Dr. Piers Robinson called Attacks on Academic Freedom, The Times of London and MI6, just to get another example of someone who's trying to explain what's actually happening and what people need to know and what happened to him as a result. So there's a really good article that came out a few days ago as well from the 25th of September, which was recommended to me by a colleague in the higher education group of the Scottish Union for Education, called The Intolerant Age: How Creeping Censorship Captured Britain's Institutions. And I just want to read you a little excerpt from this article because this shows what's happening to students. So we had a student recently who graduated, this is at the University of Exeter, and he thought that this would never happen to him when he went to university. He ran for president of the Exeter Debating Society as a moderate conservative, is what he calls himself. And against him, somebody started up a campaign called Stop the Fascist. He was viewed that way, he said, because he was standing up for free speech. I was told by the university that in order to prove that I shouldn't be disciplined, he says, I had to prove I didn't cause harm, even if I didn't intend to the other student. Exeter's regulations state that disciplinary offenses include actions which cause actual or potential distress or harm to others, irrespective of whether or not distress or harm was intended. So they said if concerns or complaints are raised by the members of the community, if they have a concern, we are duty-bound to investigate them fully, regardless of whether any harm was caused or not. So we see, once again, that students are under attack as well. There's a really good book that I would like to recommend as well if you're interested in this topic. It's called Diversity, Inclusion, Equity, and the Threat to Academic Freedom, or I would call it DIE, just for short, DIE. This talks quite a bit about, in the introduction section, the foreword to this book. It gives a lot of examples of individual cases of academic freedom and academics being canceled or no platforms silenced, losing their jobs, etc. It's a really good book, though, because it talks quite a bit about what the reality is of DIE, and a lot of it has to do with identity politics. So what identity you belong to is incredibly relevant more and more to whether or not a student is suitable to study academic topics. And this might include the intersectionality, which they talk about. I identify as a cis trans woman, putting all these different words together, Black, so race comes into it, sexuality comes into it, gender identity comes into it, and saying that, well, I have this particular position, and this is why it's important for me as an individual to study this topic. So let's see some examples of the institutions that are pushing this. Universities UK, which is a collective voice of 141 universities around the UK. So they all have these particular statements enforcing this equality, diversity, and inclusion. We believe anyone who would benefit from university education should have access to one. Well, lots of people could benefit from one, but if they can't read a full book, they might not be able to be at university, or maybe they shouldn't be. But we're producing these kinds of graduates anyway, even if they really shouldn't be at university. The NUS, which is the National Union for Students, talks about national change for students. If you look at their website, they talk about issues affecting people across society, including champion LGBTQ plus rights, pushing to decolonize education. Together, we've been a force for radical change since 1922, and we are open to all. We champion diversity, and we allow every student to thrive. So where have we heard that elsewhere with radical change in some of these agendas, even outside of universities? The University College Union for November of 2019 has a position on trans inclusion, and specifically, they say that they have a long history of enabling members to self-identify, whether that is being Black, disabled, LGBT, or women. I didn't know you could self-identify as being disabled or Black, but anyway, that's what they claim. And they have a women's conference, which reaffirms that our women's structures within the union belong to all self-identifying women. I wonder if that includes the man that I saw walking out of the women's toilets recently in the library, wearing a skirt and makeup and looking at me like I was the problem, that he was the self-identifying woman who should be there. And what did I have any business going into the women's loo? We also look at some of the funders who are out there in terms of what they support. So this is the Wellcome Trust, informing things like AMR, antimicrobial resistance, which we've covered previously on the column. Genomics has endless potential if everyone is included. So now we're even talking about DIE for genomics and looking at genetic structuring of people, making sure that we're including people from the global south so that we're incredibly inclusive. We also have the Nuffield Foundation, which is another common funder in medicine. Justice, an effective, fair, and accessible justice system is fundamental to society and to societal well-being. We want to see a modern justice system that delivers equitable processes and outcomes for all. UKRI, which is UK Research and Innovation, is funded by HM Treasury, which receives its money primarily through taxes. For 2024 to 25, they have a total budget of almost £9 billion. So let's see in this next short video clip what kinds of things UKRI wants to prioritize.
Research and innovation have transformed our lives for the better, making yesterday's science fiction today's reality. From cancer therapies to clean energy, from art conservation to astronomy, we can see and feel progress all around us. Today's complex challenges need people with different experiences, skills, and knowledge to work together, challenging each other to support improvements. and working outside traditional silos. That's why UK Research and Innovation is stepping up its work in 5 broad areas that touch all our lives. Building a green future, building a secure and resilient world, creating opportunities and improving outcomes for everyone, wherever you live, securing better health, ageing and well-being for all of us, tackling infections, facing not just humans but animals and plants too. We're bringing the research and innovation community closer together, building on what pioneers in the past have already taught us to make a difference in each of these areas, in a way that people, families, businesses and communities across the country can see and be a part of. 5 strategic themes to guide our work and transform tomorrow together.
Did you catch the COVID vaccine in there?
Indeed.
Anyway.
Yes.
Anyway, so we have within the UKRI, we have several sort of separate councils. So one is the Economic and Social Research Council. They talk about sustaining a world-class, diverse, and inclusive social science research base that supports talent across the entire research career through equality, diversity, and inclusion, supported by a world-class organization, building an inclusive and diverse workforce. And AHRC, which is the Arts and Humanities Research Council, has supported by a world-class organization, including positive action on equality, diversity, and inclusion in our funded portfolio. So we can see this throughout. And then finally, just one more example from the European Commission, which is Horizon Europe, which the UK is now once again able to apply for funding through, which we weren't for a few years post-Brexit. But now it says that their main tackling climate change, helping to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and boost the EU's competitiveness and growth. Their funding from 2021 to 2027 is 93.5 billion euros. So I'd like to ask, what is the role of academia when what we're trying to be doing is getting research funding from these particular institutions and funding bodies when we see very clearly what the priorities are? Do you think that academic freedom is even possible anymore, Brian?
The answer to that is I don't. I believe it's been controlled for a long time and we're now seeing the fruits of that control. We'll talk about that more in Extra. Now, if people like what the UK column is doing, perhaps you're new to the news and you're impressed by what we're telling you today, then please support us financially. You can make a donation or you can sign up to become a member with us, monthly, annual or a lifetime membership, or you can buy something from our shop. Let's get the arrow down to the shop. And we also point out that you can get health products via Clyde de Cole from through the UK column shop and help the UK column at the same time. Now, the material we put out is to share. We're very happy for people to share it, acknowledging it's come from the column. So there's the one of the routes, but also, of course, if you remember, you can make comments, and that's also important. Now, Ben, you've got a little bit for us here on RISE.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I had a great conversation with Dr. Anne McCloskey and her colleague, Elisa Keane. Anne McCloskey is an absolute hero, legend, amazing woman, one of the strongest voices talking about vaccine damage during COVID. So it was great to speak to her. And we talked about the Northern Ireland health bill, which is unbelievably draconian. It is incredible what they're trying to get through. And there's a public consultation out which ends today. And you can find a link to that in the news show notes from the UK column website on Friday. So if you go to the notes from Friday, you can link through to the consultation from there, and you need to get your responses in today. Don't use a stock response. Write your own response. I've just found out from someone that when you use stock response, they just take all of those as one response, by the way. And you can go and check out the interview on my Substack, riseuk.substack.com.
Okay, and we got one further one, Summit of the Future here.
Yeah, I did another couple of films. This one was looking at the Summit of the Future at the end of September from the UN and just deconstructing what they've actually signed us up to and how that process has happened, because it's really fascinating when you dig into it. And then the final film as well. Brian and I are standing on each other's toes here a little bit. Then there's also Once Upon a Future, which is basically looking how they're focusing specifically on youth, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, as they're now calling it, to rush their agenda through.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And a really interesting interview going out tomorrow with Daniel New, who's talking about his son who didn't want to wear UN uniform. Now, we do have a video clip, but we're going to show that in extra time. And also, we just put up here for the Alternative View, which is an online event, Smart Cities and the Surveillance Agenda, which is the 10th of November. And you can buy tickets through the Alternative View website. Now, Ben, let's give the viewers an apology and bring you back on screen. Not an apology for you, but I think you're about to show somebody.
Yes, we're going to show a quick video clip actually about from Goals House, which is the global propaganda hub for these UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they ran one of their events at the UN General Assembly in New York at the end of September. Let's take a look.
The thing I love about Goals House is that it brings together people with all different backgrounds, all different knowledge bases and experiences, and creates an environment in which you can have thoughtful conversations that drive action.
We need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to collaborate with as many partners as we possibly can.
One important principle is that as a company, you do not need to wait to be told what you believe is the responsible thing to do. You can take action and drive the power that business has as a platform for change.
Driving progress towards net zero is critical for the corporate sector. We're often working in collaboration with others in specific industries. We've all got to make progress if any of us are going to be successful here.
I've just come from a really excellent roundtable that we hosted here on the opportunity of AI as a climate solution, and also looking at the criticality of its energy footprint and how do we work together to better understand that footprint and to collaborate to reduce it.
Probably the best thing that leaders could do to protect Indigenous-led climate solutions is really to recognize and understand the value that in at least 87 countries in the world, Indigenous-led guardianship is what is keeping the planet whole.
It's just a little window into the lives of an extraordinarily privileged and well-funded international supposed elite in the corporate and political and philanthropic worlds who are driving this agenda forwards. Right, and they're doing it in places like Goals House. Let's just have a quick look at some of the individuals we've seen on screen. So I'm sorry to do this to you, but it is Tony Blair. He's right in the mix here, absolutely in the thick of it, leading the conversation. And there is a big UK contingent, right? So we've got minor royals, or fairly minor royals. That's probably doing Princess Beatrice a disservice. She does look a little bit like a rabbit in the headlights in these things, I've got to say. And then also we had Harry there. And just worth noting that Goals House is run by Freud's group, who also run all of the communications for Astra Carter and Terra Carter. They've got very close links into the royal family. And Matthew Freud actually described the British monarch as a god in a recent interview with former Sun editor David Yellen. You should go and have a listen to that. Anyway, I don't think any of these people are gods. So who else was there? Amy Braccio, who's now running sustainability at EY. So this is right in the thick of the global public-private marketplace, the fascist system that's being used to roll out this agenda. We also had Eric Loeb from Salesforce, which is founded by Mark Benioff, who is a member of Linda Rothschild's Council for Inclusive Capitalism. So this ecosystem, this network is basically all the same. It's the same thing. You know, we're talking about global corruption. They have different logos, a few different faces, but the language and the agenda is the same. It's all going in the same direction. It's being driven by these big tech firms like Salesforce, like Google, absolutely at the center of this. So we heard Kate Brand there, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Google, talking about using AI to fix the climate crisis. And it's kind of hilarious because these people are tying themselves in knots at the minute about how much electricity artificial intelligence uses, whilst they're using it to try to fix the climate crisis. Makes absolutely no sense, right? But, you know, Does that matter? Probably, actually, but we'll find out what happens there. And this is kind of the lifestyle that we're talking about, So you've got ethnically diverse female DJs playing music in expensive bars in New York. And a lot of these people think that that is their role to play in saving the world, right? If only it was so easy. We cut the video short, so we didn't actually get onto some of it because it's about 3 minutes long. We'll provide a link to it in the show notes. But we also had this crowd, which is the 100 Davos Women crowd. Right? It's just literally well-connected rich women flying around the world to find high-paid jobs for themselves and their other rich friends. Right? It's literally what we're looking at here in the name of sustainable development, supposedly. We got a top person from Comic Relief in the US who's very keen to talk about the youth agenda, which is a big part of how this thing's going to be implemented or how they'd like to implement it. And who's paying for it? All of these people, as per usual.
Ben, thank you very much. And it is all the usual people, isn't it? There's no doubt about that. Every time we're doing analysis on this, we seem to be coming up with these individuals. While they're wining and dining at the finest restaurants, eating the best possible food and drinking the finest wines, they're not suffering. Diane, tell us about the suffering that hurricanes are doing currently and have done in the past.
History first, because I lived through some very personal experience during Hurricane Katrina and Rita, which was in 2005. And so what I think I would like to do is trace back to what happened in 2005 and for several years following, and then lead us up to where we are now and just make a little bit of commentary on the politicization and the media issues related to the recent hurricanes. So if you could please watch this video. This is just a minute and a half of old CNN coverage covering the aftermath, which was truly devastating on Hurricane Katrina.
In the evening hours after Hurricane Katrina struck, we still were getting close-ups of the crisis. Mere hints at that point of the devastation, the loss, and the struggle to survive.
You have any ailments, broken bones? No.
Into the night, it started to become evident. This truly is a disaster beyond what many people had imagined. So many rescues, the Coast Guard carrying at least 100 people from one community, boatload after boatload to safety. So many stories to tell.
It's horrific. It was horrific. I kept a cool head, told my wife we were going to survive it. She was panicking.
The morning after, 80% of New Orleans was underwater, up to 20 feet in some places. The flooding made worse by a break in the 17th Street Canal, unleashing a gusher that swallowed homes and entire communities.
The city's a bowl. It's like a bathtub with large parts below sea level. So the estimates are it would take 3 months, 90 days to get rid of that water.
A city in ruins, from the vast cavern of the Superdome to downtown hotels, and so many homes, and so many people who live there trapped.
Here, we've got a rescue in progress.
Or worse.
We got up in the roof, all the way to the roof, and water came and had just opened up, divided.
Who was at your house with you?
My wife.
Where is she now?
Can't find her body. She gone.
So Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the 29th of August, 2005. People were stranded for days. And by the time we got to September the 2nd, 2005, what did President George Bush have to say about the devastation? Let's find out.
And Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. The FEMA director's working 24 hours. They're working 24 hours a day. Again, my attitude is if it's not going exactly right, we're going to make it go exactly right. If there's problems, we're going to address the problems. And that's what I've come down to assure people of. And again, I want to thank everybody. And I'm not looking forward to this trip. I got a feel for it when I flew over before. For those who have not trying to conceive what we're talking about, it's as if the entire Gulf Coast were obliterated by the worst kind of weapon you can imagine. And now we're going to go try to comfort people in that part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if you weren't aware, Michael Brown, who he referred to there as Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job, was the only experience that he had before directing FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Association responsible for disaster recovery, was that he was the commissioner of the International Arabian Horse Association for 9 years. And he ended up leaving that job and then suddenly is in charge of emergency management for the entire country. So there's a lot of questions around what the FEMA trailers that happened at the time, because there were tens of thousands of people who lost their homes. These FEMA trailers were put into place to have people have a place to live. Unfortunately, they were not safe places to live. They were filled with formaldehyde. People were getting really sick living in them. They were not adequate for any sort of human consumption at all whatsoever, but that's what they had. And they stayed in them in some cases until 2012. And eventually there were claims of almost $15 million to try to recover the damages that people experienced after living in these trailers. So I was in New Orleans in 2006 in June. It was the first conference that came back. So we have from August 2005 until June 2006. And the first conference that came back was the American Library Association conference, which I attended. The convention center was one of these places where they held people for days before they were able to get them out. These were generally the people who were too poor to leave or evacuate on their own. So what happened at the convention center? Well, the next photo, these are all my photos, by the way. The next photo shows that part of the convention center, and this was June 2005, 10 months later, were still covered, where you couldn't see in because the devastation was still too awful to be seen. So there was only part of the convention center that was opened up. And that's the level that we are talking about in terms of recovery. A lot of photos over and over again where you see the water line on these houses. And this was mile after mile. I took a bus tour that showed us some of the devastation. And we really went to more of the middle class areas. And obviously the lower class areas were even worse. But we saw house after house like this completely destroyed. Here's another one, a nicer house at one point, obviously, now completely obliterated, to use George W. Bush's term. And we see again here the photos of, in this case, what were called the crosses, the Katrina crosses. And in the show notes, there's an article, a really good article about these, where they were spray painting information on every house. And it included information like how many dead bodies were found in the house, how many people were stranded, how many animals were found, how many dead animals were found, and so on. So the eyes of the storm, which was from the people the Dallas Morning News, were several people that I interviewed for the PhD dissertation when I finished my PhD on photojournalism professionals, talked a lot about their experiences of going there and filming, and they were actually involved in recovery efforts because FEMA didn't send enough people to help them. And so we see like over and over again that we saw this failure on FEMA's side. So now we come into, this year, we have two hurricanes, which were not as intense at all as Katrina and Rita were in 2005. But what's happening, they're politicizing the situation. So what did Biden say a few days ago about Hurricane Milton? Let's see the video.
You spoken with former President Trump at all?
Are you kidding me? Mr. President Trump, former President Trump, get a life, man. Help these people.
But you said you were going to hold those accountable.
Public will hold them accountable. You better than the press hold them accountable because you know the truth.
Will you plan to speak with former President Trump?
No.
So it appears, though, President Biden doesn't think he's president right now. He's going back to President Trump. What did Kamala Harris say a few days ago on The View about the hurricane relief?
Right now, there is a monster storm barreling towards my state of Florida, a place that's still reeling from Hurricane Helene. Trump is lying, claiming that the Biden administration is intentionally withholding aid from the areas where Republicans live and that FEMA funds are being redirected to migrants. Ironically, that is something he did in 2019. What do you think the effect of these lies are, and why is he doing this?
Well, it's profound, and it is the height of irresponsibility and, frankly, callousness. So lives are literally at stake right now. I traveled to Georgia and to North Carolina after Hurricane Helene. In Georgia, I met a woman who, just days earlier, her husband was killed in their home by a fallen tree.
So what we're seeing here is manipulation. We're seeing they were ramped up the fear on heading up to the hurricanes, which, not to say that lives weren't lost, because they were, but we see Kamala Harris saying someone got hit by a tree. Well, if she had been watching the devastation that has happened for hundreds of years, and, even in our lifetimes, these things like Katrina and Rita, to know the horrible things that happen to people. And she's like, someone was hit by a tree. And somehow that's supposed to create all of this emotional reaction. We're also seeing a lot of back and forth from FEMA about the budget for disaster relief. We're seeing a lot of labels around, people are dying, but they're also saying we're running out of money. We see that FEMA spent $4.9 billion on COVID in 1 month, 20 times more than on aid for Hurricane Helene. We're also seeing as well information that they are labeling as misinformation or disinformation, where we're talking about, well, it's all because of disinformation, blaming Donald Trump largely around it, that it's all Donald Trump's fault. So they can say that because he's not in office currently, I guess. There's been a lot around $750 for hurricane disaster payments. And Trump is saying, well, that's all they're giving them on the Democrat side is $750, when actually $750 is what they're saying is the initial payment. So we'll see what happens. There's been some discussion around this, and I don't have any way to verify this, but I just thought I would throw it out there, that Tampa was the main city that was in the line of Hurricane Milton a few days ago. And there was some damage there, although not as much as they expected. So there's been, if you go back to 2016, we can see the discussion of Bill Gates and his colleagues wanting to build a 15-minute city ecosystem in Tampa. And there was millions of billions of dollars that were already allocated to this work back in 2016. And they have right now a system called Tampa Moves, which is again based on equity, diversity, safety, mobility, opportunity, that this is all being implemented by the current mayor of Tampa. So I'm not saying that this is actually what is going on and that the hurricane has anything to do with it, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to potentially point out. One other thing I would also like to point out is that the Trump is attacking from the other side, saying, well, he's saying, well, all the money is going to migrants, but it should be going to FEMA. I'm not really sure what's going on, different pots of money and so on. But basically what we're seeing is just a lot of political things going on in the days getting very close to the American election, when actually there was some damage done. There were some lives at stake, but potentially not as much as the fear was trying to get us leading up to Hurricane Milton. But again, there was, damage that happened. And also, just finally to point out here, there's always the UN. The globalists are always involved. The Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. I just want to say that there has been a lot of interest in how much money is going back to or from the United Nations, and whether or not there is any financial implication to the hurricanes that just seem to keep happening, Brian. I don't have an answer. I just want to throw it out there.
Okay, Diane, thank you very much. Well, a lot of people suffering, and just disgusting that a political system in America is using that for political advantage and not getting down to assisting people on the ground. But we've got this callous manipulation going on here in the UK. I had a look at the Ministry of Defence Twitter page this morning, and what do I see? I see posts about the work that UK is doing to train military and civilian staff in Ukraine to deal with the injuries. The number of Ukrainian dead and injured has risen steeply because, of course, they're now retreating many places on the front. But the Ministry of Defence in UK does not want to talk about this. It talks about the training to deal with the casualties, and then it tries to say that because the Russian casualties have increased, which of course it will if they are advancing and attacking on the front lines, the whole of the spin of this pernicious site is that it's Russia that's suffering the huge casualties, whereas the truth is it is the Ukrainians that are suffering the huge casualties, because the battle front for the Ukrainians is now starting to collapse. And as the Ukrainian troops retreat, they do not have strong defensive positions, and therefore they're taking casualties. But if we have a look at this BBC report, here's the headline: Fighting Russia, Low Morale. This is a truth. truth, because at the moment there's an increasing number of desertions amongst the Ukrainian troops. So low morale on Ukraine's most dangerous front line. But the BBC hides the brutal truth in plain sight, because under that photo was a statement. Let's have a look at the statement, because Alexander said, "We have not been able to stabilize the front." What is he talking about? He's talking about the fact that the Ukrainian front lines are collapsing under the weight of the Russian attack, and in retreat, the Ukrainian forces are being decimated. But of course, the BBC and the UK Ministry of Defence do not want to tell the UK public the facts. Now, I'm going to remind people that we reported a little while ago that the Ministry of Defence received a Freedom of Information request asking how many British service personnel had died while carrying out duties in Ukraine since May 2022 and how many had been injured. Well, the response from the Ministry of Defence at the time was essentially that we need to have a look at this because we're not sure it would be in the public interest. But they did subsequently in the final paragraph of the response say, "We will respond by the 25th of September 2024. Actually, there has been silence, so the Ministry of Defence in UK, well past the deadline, they do not want to tell the truth about British military killed and injured in Ukraine. So at the moment, silence, no response. But this is where it gets really bad, because when a local politician was asked about casualties, he said this: "I would like to reassure you that there have been no British Armed Forces personnel who've been deployed in Ukraine, nor are there plans to send British soldiers to fight in the conflict." Now, this is a response to a member of the public in the last few days, and it's clear that the MP Jack Rankin has no idea what the situation is in Ukraine, and nor how British and other NATO troops are on the ground and have been injured. So we wait to see when the British Ministry of Defence will actually respond to this request. But at the moment, it's spin and propaganda to ensure that despite the billions of pounds of UK money, which is sustaining the war, helping to sustain the war, we are not to be told the truth about what is happening on the ground. And I'd just like to say to our audience, back in 2017, we were warning about the Conservative government at the time refusing to talk accurately about British military boots on the ground in Syria. This is Michael Fallon talking about putting ground troops into Iraq or Syria would help the ISIL narrative. And it would help further radicalise its potential supporters. So they preferred to leave it to other people to deal with it. But of course, special forces were put in. Here's Cameron saying that if we're going to succeed in defeating ISIL either in Iraq or Syria, there will need to be boots on the ground, but they should be Iraqi boots on the ground. So this is the lie given to the public underneath the British troops were deployed. And here's Theresa May, and the comment was that she declined to rule out ground forces being used. And lastly, I'm going to say that, of course, we don't even know who our politicians are acting for, because this is back in 2014, where Cameron was telling Netanyahu that his belief in Israel is unshakable. So we'll end the news there. It's clear that we're now in Britain 2024, where we cannot believe the news as put out by the government itself, or of course the BBC. So we're in the post-truth era. And I'm going to say to our viewers and listeners, if you like what we do in trying to cut through the lies and deceit, then please do support us financially, because we need that financial support to exist. Ben and Diane, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining me today. Very serious events in the world, but we need to talk about it. If our audience are subscribers, members of UK Column, please join us for extra time, and we'll have a look at some of today's stories in a bit more detail. So we'll see you in a few minutes. For the wider audience, UK Column News will be back on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.